Ziad Rabbani here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 500 stations around the country, on Pacifica and NPR stations, low-power FM, college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks on Dish Network Channel 9415 Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on DirecTV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are also available in Spanish and transcript and audio form for any radio station to take, as over 150 are around the world. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest today is Naomi Klein. She took the world by storm with her first book, No Logo. Now she is back with The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Naomi, you're talking about Milton Friedman expanded to the Chicago School.
Right. So the influence of Milton Friedman comes from his role in really being the popularizer of what's known as the Chicago School of Economics. He taught at the University of Chicago. He studied, actually, at the University of Chicago, and then he went on to be a professor there. He was mentored by one of the most radical free market economists of our time, Friedrich von Hayek, who also taught for a time at the University of Chicago. And the Chicago School of Economics really stands for a counter-revolution against the welfare state. In the 1950s, the Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League schools tended to be dominated by Keynesian economists, people like the late John Kenneth Galbraith, who believed strongly that after the Great Depression, it was crucial that economics serve as a moderating force of the market, that it soften its edges. And this was really the birth of the New Deal, the welfare state, all of those things that actually make the market less brutal, whether it's some kind of public health care system, unemployment insurance, welfare, and so on. This was actually, the post-war period was a period of tremendous economic growth and prosperity in this country and around the world. But it really did eat into the profit margins of the wealthiest people in the United States, because this was the period where the middle class really grew and exploded. So the importance of the University of Chicago Economics Department is that it really was a tool for Wall Street, who funded the University of Chicago very, very heavily. Walter Wriston, the head of Citibank, was very close friends with Milton Friedman. And the University of Chicago became kind of ground zero for this counter-revolution against Keynesianism and the New Deal, to dismantle the New Deal. So in the 50s and 60s, it was seen as very, very marginal in the United States, because the big government and the welfare state and all these things that have become sort of dirty words in our lexicon, thanks to the Chicago School, they didn't have access to the halls of power. But that began to change. It began to change when Nixon was elected, because Nixon was very close with Milton Friedman. Although Nixon decided not to embrace these policies domestically because he realized he would lose the next election. And this is where I think you first see the incompatibility of these free market policies with a democracy, with peace. Because when Nixon was elected, Friedman was brought in as an advisor. He hired a whole bunch of Chicago School economists. And Milton Friedman writes in his memoirs that he thought, finally their time had come. They were being brought in from the margins, and this sort of revolutionary group of these counter-revolutionaries were finally going to dismantle the welfare state in the USA. And what actually happened is that Nixon, looked around, looked at the polls, and realized that if he did what Milton Friedman was advising, he would absolutely lose the next election. And so he did the worst thing possible, according to the Chicago School, which is impose wage and price controls. And the irony is that two key Chicago School figures, Donald Rumsfeld, who had studied with Friedman as a sort of, I guess he kind of audited his courses. He wasn't enrolled as a student, but he describes this time as studying at the feet of geniuses, and he describes himself as a young pup at the University of Chicago. And George Shultz were the two people who imposed wage and price controls under Nixon, and when Nixon declared we're all Keynesians now. So for Friedman, this was a terrible betrayal, and it also made him think that maybe you couldn't impose these policies in a democracy. And Nixon famously said we're all Keynesians now. But the catch was He wouldn't impose these policies at home because it would have cost him the next election, and Nixon was reelected with a 60% margin after he imposed wage and price controls. But he unleashed the school on Latin America and turned Chile under Augusto Pinochet into a laboratory for these radical ideas, which were not compatible with democracy in the United States, but were infinitely possible under a dictatorship in Latin America.
Explain what happened in Chile.
Well, I think, Democracy Now! Viewers and listeners know this chapter in history, which was that after Salvador Allende was elected, a democratic socialist was elected in 1970, there was a plot to overthrow him. And Nixon famously said, "Make the economy scream." And the plot had many elements, an embargo and so on. And finally, the support for Pinochet's coup on September 11th, 1973. We often hear about the Chicago boys in Chile, but we don't hear that many details about who they actually were. And so what I do in the book is I retell this chapter of history, but for me, the economic agenda of the Pinochet government is much more front and center, because I think we do know the human rights abuses. We know about we know about Pinochet rounding up people, taking them to stadiums, the summary executions, the torture. We know a little bit less about the economic program that he pushed in the window of opportunity that opened up after the shock of that coup. And this is where it fits into the shock doctrine thesis. I think if you look at